And right now, we can just begin our scientific program. It is a great honor to welcome one of the most internationally recognized names in the field of plant breeding, Professor Dr. Rex Bernardo. Rex Bernardo is a distinguished university teaching professor and endowed chair in maize breeding and genetics at the University of Minnesota in the US. He developed the widely used genomic-based linear Bayesian prediction or GBLUP procedure in 1994, and most of his work has focused on marker-assisted breeding. Dr. Bernardo has written two textbooks and teaches graduate courses in plant breeding and in professional skills for scientists, as well as undergraduate course on coffee. And about the this talk, predictive breeding has focused on assessment the performance of candidates for multiple traits, but what are other aspects of predictive breeding in plants? And how can AI via machine learning can help? To answer all of these questions, we would like to invite now Dr. Hex Bernardo to answer all of these questions to us. And please be welcome to be here with us.
Well, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this symposium. I continue to wish everybody all the best as you continue to organize the actual symposium, but it is an honor and a pleasure for me to be part of this launch event. So today I'll be talking about predictive breeding and AI. I do not have any slides, so I'll just be talking to you like this as if we were in a podcast. About 10 years ago, maybe a little over 10 years ago, I wrote a paper called Bandwagons I Too Have Known. And what is a bandwagon? A bandwagon is an idea, an activity, a concept that becomes more popular as more people adopt it. And as we look at the history of plant breeding, of plant improvement, there have been a lot of bandwagons that have come and a lot of bandwagons that have gone. You know, for example, you could think of hybrid breeding as a bandwagon that became wildly successful. There are other bandwagons such as induced polyploidy or mutation breeding or idiotype breeding that might not have been as successful. And as the field evolves and as the field develops, we continue to have new technologies that come to the fore. And these new technologies then introduce new possibilities in how we could breed plants for human benefit. And today, if I were to think of the current technologies that are on people's minds a lot, I think artificial intelligence or AI is certainly a technology that we think of a lot. And often we think of this technology in the context of predictive breeding. And so today I'm going to focus on, well, predictive breeding and how AI can affect the way that we do predictive breeding. So just as a bit of introduction, what is predictive breeding? A broad definition of predictive breeding is simply trying to assess the performance of a candidate or of a population before it is phenotyped out in the field or in the greenhouse or in some other environment. So we're trying to predict, essentially, the performance of a candidate, of an individual. It could be a hybrid, it could be a population, it could be a test cross, it could be a clone for an asexually propagated crop. We're trying to predict the performance of this individual before we phenotype it. And predictive breeding is not new at all. In fact, I would argue that predictive breeding is more than 90 years old. If we think of when hybrid corn was first introduced, the corn hybrids were not single crosses. Instead, they were double crosses. They were a cross involving 4 parental inbreds. And back in the 1920s, 1930s, it was important for breeders to be able to predict the performance of a double cross hybrid before that double cross hybrid was made. So in fact, the first time I think that the term predictive was used in plant breeding was in a publication that by 2 professors at the University of Minnesota at that time when they were predicting the performance of corn double crosses. Another iteration of predictive breeding was when Quantitative geneticists develop methods to predict the performance in terms of response to selection, meaning to say that what if we're doing half SIB recurrent selection, or if we're doing full SIB recurrent selection, or reciprocal recurrent selection, what is the predicted performance of the next generation? And these equations for prediction were developed, but in my opinion, they were not really used that much because breeders simply did selection without trying to predict the performance of the next generation. So predictive breeding became much more important in the recent 10, 20 years when breeders started to develop breeding schemes that would require that indeed we predict the performance of individuals, even individual plants, before we actually evaluate them in the field. And if I were to summarize the state of the art of predictive breeding right now, I would say that yes, for sure, we can predict the performance of different kinds of candidates for different types of traits. We know that we can do that. For example, as has been mentioned, genomic prediction or genome-wide prediction has become very popular these days in the literature, as well as in major breeding programs for corn, for soybean, for other major species. Genomic prediction is routinely used because the cost of genotyping oftentimes is lower than the cost of phenotyping. And so by now, we know how to predict the performance of individuals for different traits. And we now know how to create training populations. We know some best practices. For example, we know that the strongest driver of the prediction accuracy is the relatedness. If I'm predicting the performance of this set of candidates from another set of candidates that both have been genotyped, but my training population has been genotyped and phenotyped, we know that it is the relatedness between the test population and the training population that drives the power of that prediction. So as long as we can have related individuals and we use phenotypic data and genotypic data on the related individuals to predict the performance of individuals that have been genotyped but not yet phenotyped, we know that those predictions tend to work quite well. We also know that the size of a training population is important. We know that we need to have a sufficient number of markers. And for the most part, I think we are in that era in which sometimes we actually have too much marker data rather than too few markers. And sometimes we find ourselves throwing away marker data because they are not of good quality. And in fact, what's important today is the cost of genotyping, not per data point, not the cost of genotyping per marker individual combination, but the cost of genotyping on an individual basis with the understanding that we genotype for a certain number of markers. So the point is, yes, we want a good relatedness. We want a large training population. We want heritability to be reasonably high, and we need a sufficient number of markers. And we know that if those conditions are satisfied, relatedness, large training population, sufficiently high heritability, and a large number of markers, we know that predictions work. And we know that predictions work well to the extent that it is possible to now restructure a breeding program to take advantage of predictions. For example, one common way of restructuring breeding programs today is to eliminate the first stage of testing. Oftentimes in a breeding program, that first stage of testing might be based on only one or two locations. And because of the limited replication across locations or environments, then the heritability isn't high and the quality of phenotyping might not be that good. And because of that, Breeders in major organizations have found out that instead of going through that first stage of testing with a limited number of locations, you're actually better off with relying on predictions as a substitute for that first stage of testing. So after the predictions are made and the candidates are selected, then they are evaluated at a larger number of locations. So again, just to say, we know number one lesson out of three. I have three lessons today, actually. The first is that we can predict performance. We know how to do that, and we know how to do that well. Now, the second point is, why do we want to predict performance? If you think about it, from a breeder's perspective, what is the purpose of predicting in corn, for yield, or for moisture, or for lodging? If you're working with a horticultural species, what is the purpose of predicting for quality, for sweetness, for post-harvest characteristics? Why do we want to do that? Well, one reason that we want to predict performance is so that a breeder then can determine, should I keep this variety or this candidate in my breeding program or not? In other words, when we talk about predictive breeding, a second level or a second layer of predictive breeding is, can we predict breeding decisions? Can we predict breeding decisions? So a breeder, as we all know, makes many decisions in the context of a breeding program. For example, a breeder would choose which parents to cross. A breeder would choose which locations to use in evaluation. But how I think the most common types of decisions that a breeder makes is, okay, I have crossed parent 1 and 2. I now have, let's say, 100 progeny in parent 1 and 2. Out of these 100 progeny from parent 1 and 2, which ones do I keep in my breeding program, and then which ones do I not keep? And the ones that I keep, you then put for further testing in the breeding program. So a next question then in predictive breeding is, can we predict which individuals will be selected by a breeder? I'll say that again. Can we predict which individuals, which candidates will be selected by a breeder? I became interested in this topic back in the early 1990s. I was working with an organization, a breeding organization back then, Limagrain or Limagran in French. And I found myself being involved with breeding teams, and we were going through a lot of data. F3 on tester, F5 on tester, first year of testing, second year of testing of hybrids, and so forth. And it brought to my mind, is there a way that we can begin to assist a breeder in making these selection decisions? Can there be a way that we can actually try to predict which candidates would be kept by a breeder and which would be discarded or not kept by a breeder? So I worked on this subject called retrospective index weights. Retrospective index weights, as retrospective means taking a look back. We're taking a look back in the past. And what a retrospective index does is that it tries to estimate the trait weights that a breeder uses in his or her mind as he or she makes those breeding decisions. The context is that if you ask a breeder, let's say a corn breeder, if you ask a breeder, how much weight do you put for yield? How much weight do you put for moisture? How much weight do you put for plant height, disease resistance, or whatever trait? A breeder might say, I don't really know how much weight I put. But if you ask the breeder, can you select, in your opinion, which are the best and not the best? Then the breeder would say, yes, I can certainly select which ones I think should be kept and which ones should not be kept. In other words, in his or her mind, the breeder is using a weighting of the traits. So a retrospective index, it's a classical type of selection index that tries to estimate those weights. So I did that in the context of the Limagrain breeding program, and I found that indeed, number one, yes, we can estimate the weights that are intuitively used by a breeder in making selection decisions. And now when we apply these index weights to independent germplasm undergoing selection, actually the results were that we could predict about 78% of the selections made by the breeders. In other words, through retrospective index weights, the best selections by the breeders, 78% of them would also have been selected if we relied on retrospective index weights. What's the point? Well, even back in the early 90s, we already had methodologies to try to predict which individuals would be kept by a breeder. In other words, even back in the 1990s, we could already begin to predict selection decisions by breeders. Now, more recently, I had a PhD student named Isaias Ariza. And Isaias was interested in artificial intelligence and interested in machine learning. So one of the PhD thesis projects that I had Isaias work on was, well, can we use AI to begin to model selection decisions by breeders? Can we use AI to predict whether a line or a hybrid would be kept by a breeder or not kept by a breeder? So obviously AI is in the literature today. It's in the internet. It's all over the place. You hear about AI when you're browsing through different web pages, when you're shopping. AI is at work and making suggestions of other things for you to buy. And so AI is simply using machines to mimic human intelligence. And AI is a broad field. For example, machine learning is a part of AI, but not all AI involves machine learning. I'll say that again. Machine learning is a part of AI, but not all AI is machine learning. A good example of AI that is not machine learning was the chess championships from the 1990s, when Deep Blue, which was a computer built by the IBM Corporation, defeated the world chess champion at that time, Garry Kasparov. So Deep Blue did not employ machine learning, but it was a rules-based machine. It had a large database of chess games and chess moves, and based on that database of chess games and chess moves and different set of rules, it then identified from millions of possible combinations which should be the next chess move to beat the chess grandmaster world champion Garry Kasparov, and indeed it beat the world champion. Now, when we talk about machine learning, there are other different forms of machine learning: unsupervised machine learning, supervised machine learning. We have reinforcement learning. We have deep learning. And I also found that, for example, simple linear regression or multiple regression, that is actually part of machine learning. So if you have been using multiple linear regression in some of your research, as I have used multiple linear regression, it also means that you already have been using machine learning. And if you have used multiple regression, it also means you have already been using AI. So again, just a brief introduction to this broad field of AI. So what Isaias did, again, in his PhD thesis was to answer the question, can we replicate, can we mimic, duplicate breeders' decisions? So what Isaias did is he asked 7 very experienced maize breeders to make selection decisions on a group of maize populations. 7 maize populations to be exact. And the next step was to train AI models to look at 6 of the 7 populations as a training population, and then using the model from those 6 populations to predict performance in the 7th training population. And you then go through that and you predict the performance of population 1 from the remaining 6, population 2 from the remaining 6, population 3 from the remaining 6, in a cross-validation way until you predict the performance of population 7 from populations 1 to 6. And this is what Isaias found. 3 main findings. Number 1, Isaias found that the probability that a random breeder-selected line was ranked ahead of a random non-selected line was 90%. I'll say that again. If you take all of the lines selected by the breeders and all of the lines not selected by a breeder, and you pick a random line selected by a breeder and a random line not selected by a breeder, the probability that the selected line would be picked before the non-selected line was 90%. And that's quite a high probability. If the picking as random is random, it's like flipping a coin. It's a 50% probability. But now here we're talking about a 90% chance that the machine would pick a line selected by the breeder before it would predict the line that is not selected by a breeder. And that's a very high probability from a machine learning or AI standpoint. Second is that the probability that the machine exactly replicated or exactly duplicated the breeder's decisions was about 70 to about 80%. About 70 to 80% of the breeders at a given selection threshold were duplicated exactly by the machine. And by the way, we did not ask the breeders to select a certain proportion of lines. It was completely open-ended. We said just select the best line according what you think is best, and we'll ask the machine to try to replicate your decision, and it did it 70 to 80% of the time. We also found that different methods varied in their ability to duplicate breeding decisions, and that the two best methods, number one was actually the simplest method, which is logistic regression. Logistic regression is traditional multiple regression, but modified so that it would work for a binary trait, 1, 0, yes or no. So simple logistic regression, which has been around for a long time, 1960s, it works quite well. And another method called gradient boosting also works quite well. And the point is actually there's no reason to use the same method for everybody. We found that for some breeders, one method worked better, and for other breeders, another method worked better. So what's our conclusion from the second point? Again, our first point is, number one, we know that we can predict performance. Number two, we also now know that at least in corn, in maize, we can predict breeder decisions fairly well. We can predict breeder decisions well enough so that it is possible to think of a decision support system based on AI, meaning that a breeding organization or a company could create an AI system to help the breeders make selection decisions. So that a breeder, if the breeder is looking through a lot of data, the idea then is that the machine would make that first cut of the data and say, okay, if the breeder is selecting the best 20%, the machine might select the best 25, 30%. So the breeder can then spend more time to examine the most promising candidates and not have to spend time looking at the candidates that really are not good to start with. Now, this idea of predicting breeder decisions brings two things to mind. Number one, especially for master's and PhD students who are on this live stream, how does that affect the way that we teach and educate our students in plant breeding? Number two, what does it do to future employment or job prospects? With AI, does it mean that we'll need fewer breeders in the future, for example? And number three, do we really want to predict breeders' decisions exactly? Do we want to exactly predict breeders' decisions? And my argument would be probably not. Maybe we don't exactly want to predict breeders' decisions because, number one, breeders can make mistakes. They can get tired, they can be distracted, they could have biases. For example, a breeder might have a bias against certain pedigrees or might have a bias for certain pedigrees and would overemphasize or de-emphasize those pedigrees for which there is a bias. So maybe we don't want to exactly predict a breeder's decision. Or maybe the AI system can identify candidates that the breeder fails to select. What if there are candidates that are actually worthy, that have value, that have potential, but for whatever reason the breeder does not pick? Now, with an AI system, perhaps those kinds of candidates can be identified, and that would be beneficial then for the breeding program to not lose any good candidates that have potential as a variety later on and that could be evaluated later on in the breeding program. So those are thoughts that come to mind when we think of can we predict breeding decisions. But the third point, though, is perhaps we don't need to stop there. Because if you think about it, I said, well, why do we want to predict performance for individual traits? I answered, it's because breeders need to select yes or no, do we keep it in the breeding program or not? But why do we keep candidates in the breeding program or not? And that brings us to the third point. Well, can we predict whether a variety would be successful or not? Can we predict whether a variety would be successful or not? And I think this is an area for which AI can be useful. For example, I think there's a gap. There's something that we're not teaching plant breeding students well is how do we give weights to the different traits in a breeding program? For example, when I joined, I've experience working with a company. I was with a plant breeding company for 9 years. And when I joined the organization, I said, well, how do I know which is a good corn hybrid or not? How you do that, how I did that is, well, you learn from the more senior breeders from the organization. So by looking at the breeding decisions of the senior breeders, you're then training yourself, okay, this is a good corn hybrid, this is not a good corn hybrid. Why is it good? Why it's not good? You learn to give weight to different traits. But what if the more senior breeders are wrong? Or how do we know that they are exactly correct? So I think there's a gap in training of our breeders of how do we exactly weight the different traits. And one thought that came to mind is, well, what if instead of selecting for yield or end moisture and plant height and disease resistance in corn, what if I start selecting for dollars per acre or dollars per hectare? Or in Brazil, it would be reals per hectare. If you're in a soybean breeder, can you actually select for reals per hectare rather than just yield per hectare? Is that possible? Can AI help us with that? So in my context, in corn, if I think of selecting for dollars per hectare, I need to think of the output traits, such as how many kilograms or megagrams per hectare or bushels per acre in English units does my corn have? And what's the current price? What's the economic return of the farmer? But then I need to think of input costs as well. I need to think of, well, if the corn is a bit too wet, if it's 17% moisture and I need to dry it to 15% moisture, how much fuel does it cost to dry it down to the proper moisture for storage? So I need to subtract that input cost. What if I have a corn hybrid that has high nitrogen use efficiency versus a low nitrogen use efficiency? If I need to add more nitrogen, that is an input cost. If I need to add less nitrogen, then it doesn't cost me as much, and that affects my dollars per hectare. And then when I think of this topic, though, then I begin to run into problems, such as, what about disease resistance? How do you put a value to disease resistance? And if you think about it, well, disease resistance is like insurance. If you buy insurance, you're thankful when you don't need the insurance, and you're also thankful when you need the insurance. But really, for disease resistance, if the disease will never, ever be there, then you don't need to buy that disease resistance as an insurance. And so disease resistance, it really is hard to determine what's the dollar or real value of a certain level of disease resistance. Or how about the look of a plant? Farmers, breeders, they're interested in how a plant looks. And it might not have an economic value, but in that case, how do you assign dollars per acre for the look of the plant? And how about changes in the price? Well, I can talk about dollars per acre or real per hectare today, but I'm talking about today's prices. And we know that historically, the prices of commodities, the price of fuel, the price of fertilizer, they change through the years. And if a breeding cycle is 8 years, well, I should be looking at the prices not today, but in 8 years. But if a variety is around, if a variety is useful, not just in 8 years, but in 8 to 13 years, then I need to look at the prices from 8 to 13 years. So it becomes more complicated than it is, and perhaps maybe AI can help us figure all of this out. And what if now we can think of, well, am I looking at the price, at the dollars per acre for the producer? Or am I looking at the dollars per acre for the seed company if I'm with a seed company? Because those could be slightly different criteria too. Am I trying to make the company rich? Am I trying to make the farmer rich? And of course, I think it'll have to be a balance between the two, because the farmer needs to win, but the seed company or the breeding organization also needs to maintain a profit. So those need to be balanced in the end. Where does this leave us? Again, it is this whole realm of looking at questions. I think this is a key. As I conclude my presentation today, as I think about it, two things. Number one, or three things. Number one, we're in the age of AI. We're in the age of AI, and when I look at plant breeding, at the way breeding organizations are run, when I think of the things that students of plant breeding need to know, I think that machine learning and AI is one of them. And I feel a bit sorry for today's students, because we're asking you to learn a lot of things. But that is the reality of the field today, that at least we need to learn, we need to develop a certain level of competency in a broad range of fields before we specialize in a narrower topic. And AI, machine learning, is one of these newer topics that I believe students of plant breeding will need to learn today, because it will be very important not only today, but as we look at plant breeding in the future. Number two is, when we think of AI, when you look at the literature today with AI, oftentimes we as scientists are asking AI to do the same kinds of things that we're doing right now. For example, there's literature on genomic prediction and AI. So we know that there are good standard methods for genomic prediction, such as GBLUP, such as ridge regression BLUP. We know that these are our default methods. We know they work well. And then now we're beginning to ask the question, well, can AI methods, can they be better than ridge regression BLUP or GBLUP? And I think we're getting some mixed results, that sometimes they're better, sometimes they're not. On average, I think they're just about the same. In my opinion, based on the literature, they don't really add that much value over the approaches that we are already using. So I think the more important question is, or the more important focus should be, we need to look at plant breeding and begin to ask questions. What are things that we could not do before, or we had difficulty in getting answers before? And now that we have this tool called AI, can we apply AI then to these things we're looking into that we had problems with before? So let's use AI for new challenges, new questions, rather than problems or issues that have been pretty much solved and we have good solutions for. And number three, and my last conclusion, is that the field of plant breeding has changed a lot over the years, and it will continue to change as we have new technologies and new scientific developments that come to the fore. And so a question, what we need to do then as a community of plant breeders is to be learners. You and I, regardless of whether you're young like yourselves or older like me, we need to be learners. We need to keep learning. We should not be satisfied with what we learned in school. We need to use our time in school to develop a strong foundation in plant breeding and genetics so that we can look to the future and keep learning on our own through the literature, through discussions with other breeders, through experiments, through symposia. And so let's all be learners and keep learning about this wonderful field of plant breeding, which is the genetic improvement of plants for human benefit. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I had fun chatting with you, and I hope you got something useful out of what I have shared with you today. Thank you so much.
Hi, Doctor. Hi, Bernardo. It is a pleasure. We all really enjoy your presentation.